In recent days, the world has been shaken by the loss of Robert Redford, a man whose name had become almost inseparable from the very idea of Hollywood greatness. He passed away at the age of 89, leaving behind not just a legacy, but an emptiness that feels impossible to fill. His death was not merely the end of a long life, but a rupture that split open the collective heart of millions who grew up admiring him. The news swept across the globe like an earthquake, sudden and merciless, leaving admirers gasping for breath. As his body is now prepared for a private farewell in the quiet mountains of Utah, far from the blinding lights of Hollywood, there will be no glittering carpet, no camera flashes, no noisy celebration. Only his family, gathered in silence, holding one another through the unbearable truth that their guiding light has gone. Hollywood itself seems to stand still, frozen in mourning, and yet tributes pour from every corner of the world. Among them, one voice rose and pierced through the grief of millions. Meryl Streep, his co-star and confidant for 4 decades, whose words cut deep into the sorrow of all who listened. Her farewell was not polished, not staged, but raw, trembling with grief, and so personal, it made strangers weep as if they had lost someone of their own. Redford's journey, however, is not only measured in the sadness of his passing. His story is a testament to resilience, a tale that began not in triumph, but in suffering. As a child, Robert battled polio, confined to bed and facing the possibility that he might never walk again. Yet his mother's hands, massaging his legs night after night, taught him that true strength was not about roaring victories, but quiet determination. Her whispers of courage became the first seeds of resilience that would carry him through his darkest hours. Born in 1936, raised as an only child during the shadows of the Depression, he faced the fragility of life far too early. His restless teenage years saw him slipping into dangerous circles, testing limits, and searching for something undefined. His father's stern discipline saved him from falling completely astray, guiding him back just as recklessness threatened to swallow him. But life, never merciful, struck its cruelest blow when his mother, the same woman who had refused to let him surrender to disease, entered surgery and never came home. Her death in 1955 left him hollow, carrying a silence that even fame and fortune later could not erase. It was a wound deeper than any illness, one that shaped his adult years with grief. Though he briefly tasted the chance of success with a sports scholarship at the University of Colorado, heavy drinking cut it short, leaving him shamed and broken. He fled across Europe in his 20s, living on little, sketching, painting, walking endlessly, until the noise inside his soul softened. In those wandering years, he discovered that resilience was not about noise or applause. It was about moving forward despite fear, about surviving without surrender. That resilience would become the bedrock of the man who rose from shadows to immortality. When Robert Redford arrived in New York in the late 1950s, it appeared to outsiders that he was a young man chasing ambition. But underneath the neon lights and crowded streets, he carried wounds that never left him. He was only 22, still haunted by the silence of losing his mother and the shame of wasted opportunities. He enrolled at Pratt, clutching brushes as if painting could restore the fragments of his spirit, and then dared himself to try acting at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Acting was not an overnight salvation. It was a daily climb through rejection and survival. He scraped by with television roles in The Twilight Zone, Perry Mason, and Maverick, roles so minor they barely paid the rent. To him, survival was success in itself. But even in those small victories, a deeper wound followed him. His face, the very feature that later made him a global icon, was at first a cage. Casting directors dismissed him as too pretty, refusing to believe he had depth behind the golden looks. Redford himself admitted years later that it felt like being trapped inside a box where no one believed you belonged. He fought desperately to be recognized, not for appearance, but for his craft, clawing his way through rejection until Neil Simon's Barefoot in the Park gave him his breakthrough on Broadway in 1963. At 27, the applause that echoed in theaters was more than celebration. It was proof that someone finally saw him. That moment of vindication unlocked Hollywood, and soon he was no longer scraping by. Films followed, roles stacked up, and slowly, the boy who had once wandered Europe in silence carved himself into history. Yet, Redford never escaped the sting of rejection that had once marked him. Instead, he used it as fuel. It became the fire behind every performance and every decision. By the late 1960s and early 70s, he had achieved the kind of fame few actors ever reach. His face lit up screens in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, The Way We Were, and All the President's Men. These were not simply performances, they were roles that defined generations of cinema. To the world, he looked untouchable, the golden boy of Hollywood. But inside, he still felt the pressure of proving himself over and over again. Even at the height of stardom, doubts trailed him like shadows. When The Great Gatsby underperformed, critics were merciless, and the blow cut deeper than the public realized. Redford confessed that it felt like being judged not just as an actor, but as a human being. Yet, true to his nature, he did not retreat. He instead turned to even greater challenges, investing himself in projects that demanded honesty and courage. All the President's Men became not just a film but a declaration, a belief that cinema must reflect truth, however uncomfortable. That conviction grew stronger when he moved behind the camera to direct ordinary people. Hollywood scoffed at the idea that a handsome star could direct, expecting him to fail. Instead, he delivered one of the most poignant explorations of grief and family ever captured on film, earning an Academy Award for Best Director. For him, that award was not about prestige. It was proof that he was more than a face. It was the release from years of suspicion and the final vindication that he was an artist, not just an idol. And still, he was not done. In 1981, Redford founded Sundance, a fragile dream that many mocked but that he refused to abandon. Built from sacrifice, it became a sanctuary for independent voices, a gift to the artists he believed deserved to be heard. Through triumphs and trials, Redford transformed the very rejection he once endured into a platform for others. His golden years were never effortless. They were edged with pain, burdened by expectation, but ultimately lit with a brilliance that came only from struggle.
The shocking news of Robert Redford's passing on September 16, 2025, stunned the world with its suddenness. There were no long hospital vigils, no public farewells, no hints that the end was near. Only days earlier, he had spoken of new scripts, unfinished projects, and dreams still waiting to be brought to life. One moment he seemed immortal, the next, silence swallowed him. For fans, the grief was instant and overwhelming. But for Meryl Streep, his dearest friend and companion for nearly 40 years, it was a wound that cut into the very core of her being. She was in a makeup chair when she heard the words, "Robert Redford is gone," and the world around her collapsed. For strangers, it was a headline. For her, it was the loss of a soul who had stood beside her through storms both public and private. Their bond began in 1985 with Out of Africa, a film that remains one of cinema's greatest love stories. On screen, they embodied an unforgettable romance, but off-screen what developed between them was rarer than love. It was trust, respect, and a deep understanding that lasted decades. Streep once said that Redford made her feel seen, and in an industry filled with masks and egos, that was nearly a miracle. Their legendary hair-washing scene was more than acting. By the fifth take, Redford's hands softened, his guard dropped, and what unfolded was truth, not performance. Streep later confessed that she was in awe of his humanity in that moment. From then on, their bond became unshakable. They didn't need constant calls or public displays to prove their friendship. It simply endured, quiet and steadfast. For Streep, losing him was like losing her compass. When she stood among mourners and whispered through tears that one of the lions has left us, her grief became the voice of millions. She spoke not as an actress but as a woman, stripped bare by loss, mourning the man who had made her feel human when the world demanded perfection. His funeral, held as he wished in the stillness of Utah, unfolded without cameras or spectacle. Just family, silence, and love. Yet, through Streep's trembling words, the entire world was drawn into that mountain air. Her heartbreak became universal, her voice carrying the weight of all who mourned but could not find the words. Perhaps this was Redford's final gift. Not the films, not even Sundance itself, but the reminder that behind every legend lies a vulnerable human being. Through Meryl's sorrow, the world was allowed to see him again, not as an icon, but as the man he truly was. And in that truth, he lived again, even as he was laid to rest. For Redford's wife, Sibylle, and his children, the grief was heavier than words could ever contain. To the world, his death marked the fall of a legend. To them, it was the loss of a father, a husband, the quiet presence that had been the heart of their home. In his final years, his stride slowed, his voice softened, but his mind remained sharp, always tethered to the earth, to art, and to Sibylle, who had brought him love after decades of solitude. On September 16th, in his Sundance home beneath the vast Utah sky, he took his final breath. No fanfare, no last curtain call, just the quiet end of a life lived with dignity. For his family, the silence was crushing. Sibylle wandered through rooms that still carried his scent, touching his belongings as if they might tether him back. His children grieved for the man who had guided their brushstrokes, encouraged their cameras, and taught them patience in mountain streams. His grandchildren clung to their mothers, too young to understand but old enough to feel the emptiness pressing in. At his funeral, Sibylle laid her hand on the casket and whispered promises only for him, that she would carry on their shared art, that their vow to nature and to each other would not die with him. Her sobs filled the silence as even the mountains seemed to bow in sorrow. For her, love had not ended. It had transformed into grief too vast to bear. And yet she continued forward because it was the only way to survive. Beyond family, Redford's true legacy lived not only in films, but in Sundance, the dream he nurtured from skepticism into one of the greatest sanctuaries for independent voices. He never built shrines to his own name, instead lifting others, believing that cinema mattered because truth mattered. His estimated fortune of nearly $200 million at his passing never defined him. What mattered were the sanctuaries he built in Utah and New Mexico, not palaces of vanity, but places of peace. Even as his health waned, unfinished sketches and campaigns still lay on his desk, reminders that he never stopped searching, never stopped giving. His life was not without unbearable loss. 2 sons gone, a marriage collapsed, friends like Paul Newman and Natalie Wood lost too soon. Each wound scarred him, yet he never surrendered. Instead, he carried them as lessons, turning pain into resilience and stories that touch the world. That is why his absence feels unbearable tonight. He was not great because he was untouchable, but because he was achingly human. His greatness was fire, born from suffering and carried through endurance. And now that the curtain has fallen, how do we honor him? Not with fleeting headlines, but with remembrance, gratitude, and stories whispered across generations. If his films ever touched your soul, if his courage inspired you, let it be known. His legacy endures not just in reels of film, but in every artist Sundance lifted, in every audience moved, in every heart that still dares to rise despite sorrow. May Robert Redford rest in peace. His story does not end in silence. It echoes forever in the fire he left behind. Even as the world tries to move on, Robert Redford's absence lingers like a shadow at dusk, an emptiness that cannot be filled with awards, headlines, or even his films playing on late-night television. His passing forces us to reflect not just on the man, but on the fragile truth of what it means to live a full life. He was not flawless, and perhaps that is why he mattered so deeply. Redford battled insecurities, endured rejection, buried children, lost friends, and yet he stood up every single time. For decades, Hollywood had crowned him as the golden boy, the handsome rebel, the man whose smile could light up an entire era of cinema. But beyond the glitter, he was a man defined not by charm, but by endurance. He carried pain quietly, fought battles no camera ever caught, and offered the world his art without complaint. That, more than any fame, is why his death feels like losing a part of ourselves. Generations grew up with him, not just watching him, but finding in his characters a mirror of their own fears and hopes. In Jeremiah Johnson, he taught us about solitude. In All the President's Men, he reminded us of truth. In Ordinary People, he showed us how fragile families can be. And through Sundance, he proved that greatness is not about the self, but about lifting others. His death is not the closing of a chapter. It is the beginning of a story we must now tell for him. For Meryl Streep, for Sibylla, for his children and grandchildren, and for the millions who loved him from afar, the challenge is not to live in grief, but to carry his fire forward. It is a heavy responsibility, but also a gift. Because Redford's story whispers something vital. That no matter how broken you feel, no matter how many storms you endure, you can still rise and create something beautiful. And maybe that is why people cry when they think of him now. Not only because he is gone, but because his life proves that beauty is born from pain, that strength is built in silence, and that even when the curtain falls, the story does not die. His was not just a career, it was a lesson in resilience. Tonight, as his family mourns, as fans replay his films, and as Sundance prepares for another season without its lion, the world holds on to that lesson. We cry because he is gone, yes, but we also cry because he reminds us that one day we too will leave, and the question will be, did we endure? Did we rise? Did we leave behind something worth remembering? Robert Redford did, and that is why his name will never fade.